Welcome to this journey into the darkest corners of American history. I'm your host, and tonight we venture into the isolated hills of Appalachia, where the mountains themselves became accomplices to unspeakable crimes. Before we begin, I'd like to know, tell us in the comments where you're watching from right now and what time it is in your location. Are you listening alone in the dark? Are you safe in your home? Remember that as we descend into this story. This is a tale that historians have quietly buried, that local records have conveniently forgotten, and that families in rural Virginia still refuse to discuss in polite company. It's a story that asks uncomfortable questions about silence, about isolation, and about how far human nature can fall when removed from civilization's watchful eye. The year is 1890. The place is the remote hills of Wise County, Virginia, deep in the heart of Appalachia. These mountains, ancient and unforgiving, had always been a place where families went to disappear from the law, from society, from the modern world that was rapidly industrializing around them. Here, in valleys so deep that sunlight arrived late and left early, families lived by their own rules. And some families, like the Harrows, created rules that should never have existed. The Harrow property sprawled across 300 acres of dense forest, steep ravines and hidden hollows. To reach the main house required a 2-hour ride on horseback from the nearest town, following trails that vanished in winter and flooded in spring. The family had lived there for 3 generations, each more isolated than the last. Neighbors were few and far between, separated by miles of wilderness. The Harrows preferred it that way. Samuel Harrow was the patriarch, a man who had inherited the land from his father and grandfather before him. At 52 years old, he ruled his domain with absolute authority. His wife had died 15 years prior under circumstances that were never fully explained. The local doctor had listed it as fever, but he had never actually seen the body. Samuel raised his 6 children alone, or so the official records claimed, but the records, as we'll discover, told only a fraction of the truth. In the autumn of 1890, something happened that would finally pierce the veil of secrecy surrounding the Harrow property. A postal carrier named Thomas Webb disappeared while making his rounds. His route included the Harrow homestead, a delivery he had been making every 2 weeks for 3 years. On September 23rd, he left the town of Norton with a satchel full of mail and catalogues. He never returned. When Webb's horse wandered back into town 2 days later, riderless and panicked, the local sheriff had no choice but to investigate. Sheriff William Garrett was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or wild speculation. He had served in the Civil War, had seen death in its many forms, and considered himself unshakable. He organized a search party of 12 men and rode into those hills with the confidence of legal authority. What they found would shatter that confidence forever. The search party discovered Thomas Webb's body 3 miles from the Harrow house, partially hidden in a ravine. The official cause of death was listed as a fall from his horse, a tragic accident on treacherous mountain terrain. But several members of the search party noticed details that never made it into the official report. The unnatural position of the body, the expression frozen on Webb's face, and most disturbing of all, the fact that his mail satchel was completely empty, despite having been full when he left town. Sheriff Garrett decided to visit the Harrow property, officially to inform them of Webb's death, and to ask if they had seen anything unusual. Unofficially, something about the whole situation troubled him deeply. That visit would lead him to a small cabin hidden in a hollow 1/2 mile from the main house, a structure that didn't appear on any property maps or tax records. Inside that cabin, the sheriff found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life, something that would set in motion an investigation that uncovered secrets buried for decades, something that revealed the true horror of what the Harrow family had been hiding in those dark hills. But what the sheriff found in that cabin would shake the foundations of the entire county and raise questions that remain unanswered to this day. To understand what happened in those Virginia hills, we must first understand the world that shaped the Harrow family. The year 1890 marked a quarter century since the end of the Civil War, but in the remote regions of Appalachia, the war's wounds still festered. Virginia had been torn apart by the conflict, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. When the guns finally fell silent, many families retreated deeper into the mountains, seeking isolation from a world they no longer recognized or trusted. The Harrow family had roots in these hills, stretching back to the 1790s. According to county records preserved in the Wise County Courthouse, the original Harrow patriarch, Ezekiel Harrow, had purchased 300 acres of mountainous land for a sum that suggested the property was considered nearly worthless. The land was too steep for farming, too remote for commerce, and too isolated for community. It was perfect for a family that wanted to disappear. By 1890, the property had passed through 3 generations. Each generation became more insular, more suspicious of outsiders, more convinced that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous. They homeschooled their children using outdated textbooks and the Bible. They traded only when absolutely necessary and always sent the same family member to town, usually the most presentable, the one who could pass for normal. Samuel Harrow had inherited the property in 1875 when his father, Josiah Harrow, died of pneumonia. Samuel was 27 years old, newly married to a woman named Rebecca Thornton from a neighboring valley. According to the marriage certificate filed in Norton, Rebecca was 18 years old. The ceremony was performed by a traveling preacher whose signature is barely legible. The couple had 6 children in rapid succession. The birth records, when they exist at all, are sporadic and inconsistent. The first child, Martha, was born in 1862. But this creates a mathematical impossibility, as Samuel would have been only 14 years old, and he didn't marry Rebecca until 1865. This discrepancy was never explained, and no one thought to question it at the time. Rural record-keeping was notoriously unreliable, and families often misreported dates for various reasons: tax avoidance, draft dodging, or simply poor memory. The other children listed in various documents were Sarah, born approximately 1864, Thomas, 1867, Elizabeth, 1869, James, 1871, and Ruth, 1873. But here the records become even more confused. A census taker who visited the property in 1880 recorded 8 children, not 6. When questioned about the discrepancy, Samuel reportedly told the census taker that 2 had died in infancy and weren't worth mentioning. The census taker, eager to finish his rounds in the difficult mountain terrain, didn't press the issue. Rebecca Harrow died in 1875, the same year Samuel's father passed away. The local doctor, a man named Ezra Collins, noted in his personal journal, now preserved in the Wise County Historical Society, that he had been summoned to the Harrow property but arrived too late. He wrote, "Found the woman already buried. Samuel Harrow insistent that fever took her quickly. The children appeared malnourished and fearful, but such is common in these remote homesteads. I advised better nutrition and departed. The ride back took 3 hours in failing light. I do not wish to return to that place." After Rebecca's death, Samuel raised the children alone. Or so the story went, but neighbors, those few who lived within a 10-mile radius, occasionally reported seeing children at the Harrow property who didn't match the known ages of Samuel's offspring. When asked, Samuel would explain they were visiting cousins, or children of friends, or wards he had taken in. The explanations varied, and no one investigated further. By 1890, the household had grown in ways that seemed inconsistent with the known facts. Martha, now 28 years old, had never married and never left the property. She was occasionally seen in town, always accompanied by her father, always silent and pale. A shopkeeper named Helen Morrison later testified that Martha had once tried to pass her a note while Samuel was occupied with tobacco. Helen had looked away, uncomfortable with the desperation in Martha's eyes, and when she looked back, the note was gone and Martha was staring at the floor. The other adult children, Sarah, Thomas, Elizabeth, James, and Ruth, were rarely seen. They worked the property, hunted in the forests, and appeared perhaps once or twice a year in Norton to purchase supplies. They spoke little, avoided eye contact, and left as quickly as possible. But the most disturbing aspect of the Harrow household in 1890 was the presence of 4 young children, ranging in age from approximately 2 to 9 years old. Samuel claimed they were his grandchildren, the offspring of his adult children. But this raised obvious questions that no one dared to ask directly. Which of his children had produced these grandchildren? There were no records of marriages, no records of births, and most unsettling of all, the children bore a striking resemblance to each other and to Samuel himself that suggested something far more troubling than simple family genetics. The Reverend Amos Fletcher, who occasionally traveled through the region holding revival meetings, noted in his diary after visiting the Harrow property in 1888, "I was invited to minister to the family, but found the atmosphere deeply unsettling. The adult children seemed bound to their father by something more than filial duty. It was fear, absolute and paralyzing. The young children did not play as children should. They were silent, watchful, and when I asked their names, they looked to Samuel before answering, as if seeking permission to speak. I blessed them and departed with haste. I have seen poverty, I have seen hardship, but I have never felt such darkness in a place that calls itself Christian. I will not return." This was the world Sheriff Garrett entered when he rode up to the Harrow property on that October morning in 1890. A world where isolation had curdled into something malignant, where family had become prison, and where the mountains themselves seemed to conspire to keep secrets buried. The sheriff had brought 3 deputies with him, a decision that would prove wise. As they approached the main house, they could see figures watching from windows, pale faces that vanished when noticed. Samuel Harrow met them on the porch, his manner cordial but cold. When the sheriff asked about Thomas Webb, Samuel claimed the postal carrier had delivered mail 3 days prior and left without incident. He seemed surprised to hear of Webb's death and expressed what appeared to be genuine condolences. But the sheriff's instincts, honed by years of law enforcement and war, told him something was profoundly wrong. He asked permission to search the property, and Samuel, perhaps calculating that refusal would appear suspicious, agreed, but only to search the main house and immediate grounds. It was Deputy John Morrison who noticed the path. A narrow trail, almost overgrown, leading down into a hollow about half a mile from the main house. When Morrison asked what lay down that path, Samuel's expression changed for just a moment, a flicker of something that might have been panic, quickly suppressed. He claimed it was just an old hunting cabin, abandoned and unused. The sheriff decided to investigate. Samuel insisted on accompanying them, but Garrett ordered him to remain at the main house with 1 deputy while he and Morrison explored the trail. Samuel's protests were immediate and vehement, but the sheriff was not asking permission. They followed the path down into the hollow, where the trees grew so thick that midday seemed like dusk. And there, hidden from any casual observer, stood a cabin that would become the key to unraveling decades of hidden horror. The cabin stood in a small clearing, its windows covered with wooden boards, nailed from the inside. The door was secured with a heavy padlock, relatively new compared to the weathered wood of the structure itself. Sheriff Garrett noted the discrepancy immediately. If this cabin was truly abandoned, as Samuel claimed, why was it locked so securely? Deputy Morrison examined the ground around the structure. The earth was packed down from frequent foot traffic, and there were signs of recent activity. Fresh wood shavings near the entrance, a water bucket that hadn't yet collected rust, and most tellingly, a small child's shoe half buried in the mud near the door. Morrison held it up without a word. It was worn but not old, sized for a child perhaps 5 or 6 years old. The sheriff called out, announcing his presence in case anyone was inside. Silence answered him, thick and oppressive. He tried the door, locked. He called out again, identifying himself as law, enforcement, and demanding entry. Still nothing. Left with no choice and a growing sense of urgency, Garrett used his rifle butt to break the padlock. The metal gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the hollow. The door swung open, and the smell hit them immediately. It wasn't the smell of death. Garrett knew that odor intimately from the war, but something else. Unwashed bodies, waste, fear, and beneath it all, something sweet and sickly that he couldn't identify. Morrison gagged and stepped back. Garrett steeled himself and entered. The interior was dimly lit, slivers of sunlight penetrating through gaps in the boarded windows. As his eyes adjusted, the sheriff began to make sense of what he was seeing, and with each passing second, his horror grew. The single-room cabin contained 4 straw mattresses on the floor, each stained and filthy. Chains were bolted to the wall, thick, heavy chains more suited to restraining livestock than any legitimate purpose. Women's clothing lay scattered about, torn, dirty, and far too many garments for an abandoned structure. In one corner sat a wooden bucket that explained part of the smell. And on a crude table in the center of the room lay a stack of papers. Morrison had followed him inside, and both men stood frozen, trying to process what they were witnessing. This wasn't a hunting cabin, this was a prison. Garrett approached the table and examined the papers. What he found would later be entered as evidence in a case that would shock the entire region. The documents consisted of handwritten ledgers, letters, and what appeared to be diary entries in different handwriting styles. The first ledger he opened contained dates and cryptic notes. April 12th, 1888. Emser delivered. Female. Perfect. Kept. September 3rd, 1888. S. Delivered. Male. Deformed. Disposed. January the 17th, 1889. E. Delivered. Female. Weak. Died 3rd day. The entries went back years, page after page of clinical notations that read like livestock. Breeding records. But these weren't animals. The sheriff's hands trembled as he turned the pages. The most recent entry was dated September 15th, 1890, just 8 days ago. Morrison had discovered something else. Behind one of the mattresses, partially hidden, was a leather-bound journal. He brought it to the failing light near the door and began to read aloud, his voice shaking. July 3rd, 1889. I am Martha Harrow, and if someone finds this, they must know the truth. I am 27 years old, and I have been a prisoner in my own family since I was 13. My father... Morrison stopped reading, his face pale. Sheriff, you need to read this yourself. Garrett took the journal and read Martha's words. What followed were pages of meticulous documentation of abuse, coercion, and horror spanning more than 15 years. Martha wrote in a neat, educated hand that suggested she was far more intelligent than her silent demeanor in town had indicated. She documented dates, events, and most, damning of all, she named names and revealed the truth about the children. The 4 young children at the Harrow property were not grandchildren in the traditional sense. They were the product of Samuel Harrow's systematic abuse of his own daughters. Martha wrote that she had given birth to 2 of them. Sarah had delivered 1. Elizabeth had carried 3 pregnancies to term, but only 1 child survived. The others, Martha referred to them only as the deformed ones, had met fates she could barely bring herself to describe. She wrote about the old well behind the main house, sealed up in 1883 after her father forbade anyone from using it. She wrote about the sounds she heard at night, about her younger sister Ruth, who had died during childbirth at age 17, about how the body was buried in the woods with no marker or ceremony. She wrote about Thomas Webb, the postal carrier, who had noticed something wrong during his last visit and asked Martha if she needed help. She had been too terrified to respond, and now Webb was dead, though Martha insisted she didn't know the details of what happened to him. The last entry in Martha's journal was dated August 29, 1890. I am writing this in the cabin where Father keeps us when we are with child. Sarah is here with me now. She is 8 months along and terrified. The baby is moving wrong, she says. We have both seen what happens to the wrong ones. I have hidden this journal behind the loose board near the north wall. If I disappear, if something happens to me, please know that I tried to stop this. I tried to protect the little ones. But Father is too strong, and we are too weak, and these mountains keep all our screams trapped inside them. God forgive me for my silence. God forgive us all. Sheriff Garrett closed the journal and looked at Morrison. Both men understood the magnitude of what they had discovered. This wasn't just a crime. It was a systematic campaign of abuse, hidden by geography, silence, and a society that preferred not to ask uncomfortable questions about what happened in remote mountain communities. We need to arrest Samuel Harrow immediately, Morrison said. And we need to search the rest of the property. That well she mentioned. I know, Garrett replied grimly. Gather the evidence, every paper, every document. We're taking all of it. As they collected the materials, the sheriff noticed something else. Carved into the wooden wall above one of the mattresses were dozens of tally marks, like a prisoner counting days, and beneath them, scratched in what looked like fingernail marks, were 3 words. Help us, please. The 2 men exited the cabin carrying armloads of evidence. As they climbed back up the trail toward the main house, Garrett felt a weight settling over him that had nothing to do with the physical burden. What they had found was horrifying enough, but Martha's references to the deformed ones and the old well suggested there was more, much more, yet to be discovered. When they reached the main house, Samuel Harrow was standing on the porch, and his expression told them that he knew exactly what they had found. The deputy who had stayed behind reported that Harrow had tried twice to leave, insisting he needed to check on his livestock, but had been prevented from doing so. Garrett placed Samuel Harrow under arrest for unlawful imprisonment and suspicion of murder. As he read the charges, Samuel's facade crumbled. The man, who had maintained absolute control over his family for decades, suddenly looked old and desperate. He began to speak, offering explanations and justifications that only made things worse. He claimed he was protecting his family from the corrupt outside world. He insisted the children were born out of love. He said the mountains had always been his kingdom, and he had the right to rule it as he saw fit. The sheriff cut him off and ordered him shackled. Then he turned to the deputies. Search the property. Start. With the old well and someone ride back to town, we need more men and we need the county coroner. As deputies spread out across the Harrow property, the adult children emerged from the main house one by one. They stood silent and pale, watching their father being taken away. Not one of them spoke, not one of them resisted, and most disturbing of all, not one of them showed any expression, not relief, not grief, not anything. They stood like ghosts, waiting for permission to feel. It was Deputy Morrison who made the next discovery, the one that would turn this from a case of family abuse into something that would haunt the region for generations. He found the old well exactly where Martha's journal had indicated, behind the main house and partially concealed by undergrowth. The wooden cover had been nailed shut and marked with the same symbol that appeared throughout Martha's journal, a crude X inside a circle. They pried off the cover. The opening exhaled a smell of rot and earth. Garrett held a lantern over the darkness and peered down. At first, he could see nothing but stone walls descending into blackness. Then Morrison lowered the lantern on a rope, and as the light descended, the sheriff's breath caught in his throat. And then, in the darkness of the well, his lantern revealed something that made his blood run cold. Pause here, and tell us in the comments what you think happened to Martha Harrow, and what the sheriff found at the bottom of that well. Your theories might be closer to the truth than you realize. The lantern descended slowly into the well's depths, its light revealing stone walls, slick with moss and seepage. 20 feet down, the circle of light touched bottom, and what it illuminated would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in Virginia's criminal history. The bottom of the well was not filled with water. Instead, it had been converted into something else entirely, a burial chamber. Small bundles wrapped in rotting cloth lay scattered across the stone floor. Some were no larger than a loaf of bread, others were bigger, suggesting children perhaps a year or two old. Sheriff Garrett counted at least 15 distinct bundles, but in the dim light, and from this distance, there could have been more. "Dear God," Morrison whispered beside him, "those are children." Garrett felt bile rise in his throat, but forced himself to remain professional. "We need to bring them up, every single one. And we need a doctor who can examine them properly." The process took hours. Deputy Morrison volunteered to be lowered into the well on a rope, a task that required both physical courage and mental fortitude that few men possessed. One by one, he carefully lifted each bundle and placed it in a bucket to be raised to the surface. Some of the cloth wrappings disintegrated at his touch, revealing contents that made even this hardened lawman vomit against the well wall. As each bundle reached the surface, Garrett and the other deputies laid them out in a row on canvas sheets. By late afternoon, they had recovered 17 distinct remains. A country doctor named Samuel Pierce had arrived from Norton, summoned by one of the deputies. Dr. Pierce was in his 60s, a man who had practiced medicine through the Civil War and thought he had seen every horror humanity could produce. He was wrong. The doctor began his examination as the sun dropped behind the mountains, working by lantern light as the temperature fell. His preliminary findings, later recorded in official documents now held in the Virginia State Archives, painted a picture of systematic infanticide spanning at least a decade. Of the 17 remains, 14 were infants, newborns or babies only a few weeks old. The other 3 were older, perhaps 1 to 2 years of age. Dr. Pierce noted that several of the infant remains showed signs of severe congenital deformities. One skull was misshapen in ways he had never seen before. Another skeleton showed evidence of what he called unusual bone development consistent with genetic abnormalities. Several had what appeared to be extra digits on their hands or feet. But the most damning evidence came from examining the larger remains, the children who had lived beyond infancy. Dr. Pierce's hand shook as he wrote his report. These children showed signs of malnutrition and neglect, but more significantly, they showed evidence of blunt force trauma to their skulls. They had not died of natural causes or even neglect. They had been murdered. "This is a killing ground," Dr. Pierce told the sheriff, his voice hollow. "These children were born, examined, found wanting and disposed of like defective livestock. And based on the state of decomposition, this has been happening for years, perhaps as far back as the early 1880s. As night fell over the Harrow property, the sheriff faced a scene from a nightmare. 17 small bodies lay in a row. Samuel Harrow sat shackled in a wagon, silent, now staring at nothing. The adult Harrow children remained in the house, guarded by deputies, still refusing to speak, and somewhere in this vast property, Martha Harrow remained missing. Garrett knew they needed to search more thoroughly. The cabin and the well had yielded horrors, but Martha's journal suggested there were other locations, other secrets. He organized the deputies into search teams, each carrying lanterns, and spread them across the property. The search would continue through the night. It was near midnight when Deputy James Crawford made another discovery. In a small shed behind the main barn, hidden beneath hay and farm equipment, he found a wooden chest, secured with another new padlock. He called for the sheriff. Inside the chest were more documents, letters, journals, and most disturbing of all, photographs. The technology of photography had become more accessible in the 1880s, and someone in the Harrow family had documented their crimes with an almost clinical detachment. The photographs showed the adult Harrow daughters at various stages of pregnancy. They showed the young children, the ones who had passed inspection and were allowed to live, posed stiffly in front of the house. But most horrifying were the photographs that documented the deformed infants before their disposal. Someone had photographed them like specimens, capturing evidence of their abnormalities before ending their lives. Beneath the photographs lay letters. Some were from Samuel Harrow to his deceased father, Josiah, suggesting that this practice had begun even earlier, perhaps in the 1860s. One letter, dated 1877, read, "Father, I understand now what you meant about keeping the bloodline pure and the family isolated. Rebecca has delivered our seventh, and though the child shows the marks, I have followed your guidance. The mountains provide, and the mountains conceal. No outsider will ever understand what we do here." The adult Harrow children were separated and questioned individually. Initially, all of them refused to speak, sitting in silence regardless of what questions were asked. But as dawn broke on October 2, 1890, after a sleepless night of confronting evidence, Sarah Harrow, the second oldest daughter at 26 years old, finally broke. She spoke in a voice so quiet that Sheriff Garrett had to lean close to hear her. Her testimony, recorded in shorthand by a court stenographer summoned from Norton, revealed the full scope of the horror that had unfolded in these mountains. Sarah confirmed what Martha's journal had suggested. Their father had begun abusing Martha when she was 13 years old, shortly after their mother's death. When Martha turned 16 and bore her first child, a boy with severe deformities, Samuel had killed the infant himself and thrown it down the well. He told Martha it was God's punishment for sin and that she must atone through obedience and silence. When Sarah reached her teenage years, the same pattern began. Then Elizabeth. Samuel justified his actions through a twisted interpretation of Scripture and family obligation. He claimed that the outside world was corrupt and diseased, that marrying outsiders would weaken the Harrow bloodline, and that keeping the family pure was not just acceptable but divinely ordained. The deformities that plagued many of the infants were, Dr. Pierce later explained, the inevitable result of inbreeding. The closer the genetic relationship between parents, the higher the likelihood of recessive genetic disorders manifesting. Samuel had been essentially breeding his own daughters, and the children suffered the biological consequences. Sarah's testimony revealed that Ruth, the youngest daughter, had died during a particularly difficult childbirth in 1887. The baby had been severely deformed and stillborn. Ruth bled to death over the course of several hours, while Samuel forbade anyone from seeking outside medical help. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the woods, her death never reported. Thomas, the only adult son, had participated in the disposal of the deformed infants, though Sarah claimed he did so under duress and psychological control. James, the younger son, had been kept isolated and was, according to Sarah, simple-minded, possibly due to being the product of Samuel's abuse of one of his older daughters. The 4 surviving children, the ones who passed Samuel's inspection, were genetically the offspring of Samuel and his daughters. They showed no obvious physical deformities, but were psychologically damaged beyond measure. They spoke rarely, showed limited emotional response, and had been educated only enough to read the Bible and help with farm work. Sarah's most devastating revelation concerned Martha. 3 weeks ago, Martha had attempted to escape. She had made it almost 5 miles down the mountain before Samuel tracked her down. Sarah didn't know exactly what happened next, but Martha had not been seen since. Samuel claimed she was being corrected in isolation, but Sarah feared the worst. "There's a cave," Sarah finally whispered after hours of testimony, "about a mile north of the house. Father sometimes uses it. He called it the correction place. If Martha is anywhere, she might be there." The search party reached the cave entrance just after noon on October 2nd. It was well hidden, concealed behind brush and accessible only through a narrow ravine that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The entrance was secured with boards and another padlock, Samuel Harrow's signature security measure. They broke through and entered cautiously, lanterns held high. The cave extended deeper into the mountain than expected, the passage narrowing until men had to proceed single file. The air was cold and stale, and approximately 60 feet in, the passage opened into a larger chamber. What they found there would complete the horrific picture of the Harrow family's crimes. Martha Harrow sat against the far wall of the chamber, wrapped in a thin blanket. She was alive, though severely dehydrated and malnourished. She had been locked in this cave for 23 days. Water seeped from the cave walls, which had kept her alive, but she had no food, no warmth, and no light beyond what little filtered in from the entrance. When the lantern light fell on her, she screamed, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the chamber. It took several minutes for the deputies to convince her they were law enforcement, that Samuel had been arrested, and that she was finally safe. Dr. Pierce was summoned again, this time to treat a victim rather than examine the dead. He found Martha severely traumatized, suffering from exposure, dehydration, and infected wounds on her wrists where she had been shackled to the cave wall. But physically, she would survive. Psychologically, the damage was immeasurable. As Martha was carefully transported down the mountain to Norton, where she could receive proper medical care, the deputies continued exploring the cave. The chamber where Martha had been imprisoned contained evidence of previous occupants, scratches on the walls, torn fabric, and disturbingly, what appeared to be dried bloodstains on the stone floor. On one wall, carved deeply into the soft limestone, were names and dates. Ruth, 1887. Sarah, 1883. Elizabeth, 1884, 1886. Martha, 1890. This was where Samuel Harrow had imprisoned his daughters. When they displeased him, when they tried to resist, or when he simply wanted to break them further. This cave had been a chamber of correction and control for years. But there was one more discovery that day. In a smaller alcove off the main chamber, partially concealed by rocks, the deputies found 3 more small bundles. These were not infants. These were older children, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, based on the size of their remains. Dr. Pierce's examination would later confirm they had lived several years before being killed and hidden in this cave. These were the children who had initially passed inspection, who had been allowed to live and grow, but who later developed problems, perhaps physical, perhaps behavioral, perhaps they simply asked too many questions or tried to resist their grandfather's control, and so they too were eliminated and hidden away in the darkness. By October 3rd, 1890, the full scope of the Harrow family crimes had been documented. 20 additional remains found in the cave brought the total to 37 dead children, spanning approximately 15 years. Samuel Harrow faced charges of murder, incest, unlawful imprisonment, and a host of other crimes that would require special prosecutors from Richmond to handle, but questions remained. How had this continued for so long without detection? Why had no one in the surrounding community questioned the odd circumstances? And most troubling of all, had anyone else known? The trial of Samuel Harrow never took place. On October 15, 1890, while being held in the Wise County Jail, he was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though rumors persisted that he had been poisoned or that certain community members had ensured he would never testify publicly. The secrets he took to his grave would haunt investigators for generations. Martha Harrow survived, but never fully recovered. She spent 6 months in a sanitarium in Richmond before being released into the care of distant relatives in Kentucky who had no connection to the Harrow name. She changed her identity and lived in obscurity until her death in 1924. Before she died, she burned all her personal papers, including the continuation of her diary. She wanted no record, no memorial, no reminder of what she had endured. Sarah and Elizabeth Harrow were committed to an asylum in 1891, their testimonies deemed too traumatic for them to reintegrate into society. Thomas Harrow disappeared in 1892, and no records exist of what became of him. James Harrow was placed in a home for the mentally disabled where he died in 1905. The 4 surviving children were separated and adopted by families across Virginia and Kentucky, their true origins concealed to give them a chance at normal lives. The Harrow property was seized by the county and eventually sold at auction in 1895. The new owners demolished the main house and filled in the well. The cabin in the hollow was burned. The cave entrance was sealed with dynamite. By 1900, only foundations and overgrown paths remained as evidence that the Harrow family had ever existed. For decades, the case faded from public memory. The families who had adopted the Harrow children never told them the truth. The residents of Norton and surrounding communities rarely spoke of what had happened, considering it a shameful chapter best forgotten. Even the court records were eventually sealed, accessible only to legal scholars with specific permissions. But the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. In 1952, a graduate student named Robert Patterson from the University of Virginia was researching rural family structures in Appalachia for his doctoral dissertation. While examining county records in Norton, he stumbled upon references to the Harrow case in old newspaper archives. Intrigued, he sought access to the sealed court documents and eventually obtained permission through persistent academic requests. What Patterson discovered shocked him. He spent 3 months compiling information, interviewing elderly residents who remembered the case, and documenting what he called one of the most disturbing examples of isolation-induced family pathology in American history. His dissertation, completed in 1954, was one of the first academic attempts to analyze the Harrow case through the lens of psychology and sociology. Patterson's research included interviews with people who had been children in 1890 and remembered the aftermath of the discovery. One woman, Agnes Thornton, who was 92 years old in 1952, told Patterson, "My father was one of the deputies who searched that property. He never spoke of what he saw in detail, but I remember him coming home and sitting at our kitchen table, just staring at nothing. My mother asked what was wrong, and he said, 'We knew. God help us, some of us knew something was wrong up in those hills, and we didn't ask. We didn't want to know.' He carried that guilt until he died." Patterson's dissertation was never published commercially. The university deemed it too sensitive, and families who had adopted the Harrow children were still alive. The work remained in academic archives, accessible only to researchers. In 1971, a different kind of discovery brought the Harrow case back into limited public awareness. A demolition crew clearing land for a new highway extension in Wise County unearthed human remains in what had once been Harrow property. Forensic examination confirmed they were additional infant remains, buried in locations that had not been searched in 1890. This suggested the true body count was even higher than the 37 officially documented. The discovery prompted a brief, renewed investigation, but with all primary witnesses and perpetrators long dead, it yielded little new information. The remains were buried in a county cemetery with a simple marker: Unknown Children, 1870-1890. May they find peace. But perhaps the most significant discovery came in 1978, in a way no one expected. A woman named Carol Brennan, living in Lexington, Kentucky, was cleaning out her grandmother's attic after the elderly woman's death. Among boxes of old clothing and forgotten possessions, Carol found a leather satchel containing documents and photographs. The name on some of the documents was Martha Harrow. Carol's grandmother, she suddenly realized, had been Martha Harrow, the woman who had survived the cave, who had changed her identity, who had tried to forget. The satchel contained items Martha had kept despite her desire to erase the past. Perhaps she had been unable to completely let go, or perhaps she had wanted someone, someday, to know the full truth. Inside the satchel were additional diary pages written after 1890, photographs of the Harrow property taken by investigators but somehow kept by Martha, letters from Sarah, written from the asylum before she died in 1919, and most significantly, a detailed family tree that Martha had constructed, tracing the Harrow family back to the 1790s and documenting generations of isolation and increasingly disturbing family practices. According to Martha's genealogical research, conducted during her time in the sanitarium when she was trying to make sense of what had happened, the Harrow family's problems predated Samuel. His father, Josiah, had also married his first cousin. His grandfather, Ezekiel, had engaged in similar practices: the isolation, the belief in bloodline purity, the distrust of outsiders. These had been building for generations, creating a perfect storm of genetic degradation and moral collapse. Martha had written in 1891, "I have studied what I can about heredity and bloodlines. Scientists say that breeding too closely causes defects. I have seen this truth written in the bodies of dead children. But there is another kind of defect, a moral one. My family did not just damage bodies through their sins. They damaged souls. They twisted the very concept of family into something monstrous. I wonder if evil can be inherited, passed down like eye color or height. I pray that I have not carried it forward, that it dies with me." Carol Brennan donated the satchel to the Wise County Historical Society in 1979, though she requested that certain particularly disturbing photographs not be displayed publicly. The Society created a limited exhibit about the case, framing it as a cautionary tale about isolation and the importance of community oversight. In 1983, a psychologist named Dr. Helen Morrison, no relation to Deputy Morrison, published a paper in the Journal of Forensic Psychology titled "The Harrow Case: Multi-Generational Incest and Control in Rural America." Using Martha's documents and the available court records, Dr. Morrison analyzed the case as an example of how geographic isolation, combined with authoritarian family structure and systematic abuse, could create closed systems of horror that persisted across generations. Her paper concluded, "The Harrow case demonstrates that evil is not always extraordinary or incomprehensible. It can be ordinary, banal, and built gradually over time through small compromises and silent complicity." The mountains did not create the Harrow family's crimes. The crimes were created by choices. Choices to isolate, choices to control, choices to prioritize pride and secrecy over the welfare of children. And perhaps most damningly, choices by the surrounding community to look away, to not ask uncomfortable questions, to prioritize social comfort over the screams they must have known were echoing in those hills. The descendants of the 4 Harrow children who survived have never been definitively traced. Some families suspect they may have Harrow ancestry based on dates and adoption records, but confirmation is difficult, and most choose not to pursue it. The stigma, even a century later, remains profound. In 1995, a historical marker was placed on the site where the Harrow property once stood. It reads simply, Site of the Harrow Homestead, 1790–1895. A reminder that isolation and silence can hide the unthinkable. May we never forget to ask the difficult questions and to hear the unheard voices. The old-timers in Wise County still avoid the area. They say the land is cursed, that nothing grows properly there, that animals avoid it. Whether this is truth or collective psychological projection is debatable. What is not debatable is that the land holds memories. In the soil where the well once stood, in the hollow where the cabin imprisoned women, in the sealed cave where Martha Harrow spent 23 days in darkness. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind moves through those Virginia hills, local residents report hearing sounds they can't quite explain. Children's voices, distant and plaintive, as if the mountains themselves are finally trying to release the secrets they held for so long. So we return to the question that has haunted researchers, historians, and descendants for over a century. What really happened in those Virginia hills? The official record gives us facts. 37 documented deaths, systematic abuse spanning at least 15 years, and a family so isolated that their crimes went undetected until a postal carrier's disappearance forced the outside world to look closer. But facts alone cannot answer the deeper questions that the Harrow case raises. There are several theories, each attempting to make sense of the incomprehensible. The first theory, favored by early investigators and some psychologists, is that Samuel Harrow was simply a monster, a sadistic patriarch who used geographic isolation and religious justification to create his own kingdom of horror. According to this interpretation, he was an aberration, a singular evil that corrupted what might otherwise have been a normal, if isolated, family. This theory offers the comfort of believing that such darkness is rare and containable, that it begins and ends with one individual. But Martha's genealogical research suggests something more disturbing, that the Harrow family's pathology had been building for generations. Her documentation showed patterns of cousin marriages, increasing isolation, and strange notations in family Bibles going back to the early 1800s. This leads to the second theory, that the Harrow crimes were the result of multi-generational decay, a slow corruption that occurred when a family removed itself too completely from society's moderating influence. If this theory is correct, Samuel was not the beginning, but rather the culmination, the final, horrifying expression of values and practices that had been normalizing within the family for decades. The third theory is perhaps the most uncomfortable because it implicates more than just the Harrow family. Several historians, including Robert Patterson in his 1954 dissertation, have argued that the surrounding community must have known, or at least suspected, that something was wrong. Irregular birth records, the presence of children whose parentage made no sense, the family's extreme isolation, Martha's silent desperation during her rare appearances in town, these were not invisible. This theory suggests that the true horror of the Harrow case was not just what happened in those mountains, but the collective choice to look away, to not ask uncomfortable questions, to prioritize social comfort over the welfare of children who had no voice. Deputy Morrison's daughter, interviewed in 1968, recalled her father saying, "The worst part wasn't what we found. It was realizing that if that postal carrier hadn't died, if we hadn't been forced to investigate, those hills would still be hiding those secrets. How many other families in how many other remote places are hiding similar horrors, and how many of us choose not to see? We will never know the complete truth. Too many witnesses died without testifying. Too many documents were destroyed. Martha Harrow's decision to burn her later writings means we lost her mature reflection on what she experienced and how she understood it. The 4 surviving children, given new identities and scattered across several states, took their memories to their graves without ever publicly speaking about their early years. What we do know is that 37 children died and were hidden away like shameful secrets. We know that women were imprisoned, abused, and silenced. We know that when the truth finally emerged, the response was to quickly seal records, demolish buildings, and try to forget as quickly as possible. Even the marker placed on the site in 1995 speaks in vague terms, as if the specific details are still too disturbing to name publicly. The Harrow property sits empty to this day. No one has successfully maintained a homestead on that land since 1890. Some attribute this to superstition and local reputation. Who would want to live where such horrors occurred? Others point to more practical considerations. The land is poor, remote, and requires too much effort to maintain profitably. But whatever the reason, the mountains have reclaimed what the Harrow family once called theirs. And on certain nights, when the wind moves through those hollows and the moon is dark, local residents still report hearing sounds they cannot explain. The skeptical say it's just the wind, just animals, just the creaking of old trees. But those who have heard it, really heard it, describe something different. Children's voices, they say, distant and plaintive, calling out in the darkness as if searching for something they lost long ago. As if, even now, those mountains are trying to release the secrets they were forced to keep. To this day, no one knows the full truth of what happened in those hills. We have fragments, testimonies, and forensic evidence. But the complete story, how many truly died, how far back the abuse really went, who else might have known, remains buried in those Virginia mountains, perhaps forever. Thank you for joining us on this dark journey into America's hidden history. If this story affected you, if it made you think about the importance of speaking up and asking difficult questions, please let us know in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell to join our haunted community, because these stories, as disturbing as they are, need to be told. They need to be remembered. Not to sensationalize horror, but to ensure that silence never again becomes complicity. Until our next investigation into the shadows of history, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, the most terrifying monsters are often hidden in plain sight, protected by nothing more than our collective unwillingness to see. The mountains remember. We must remember too.